Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me. So when I was initially talking to Bob about what paper to give, I think I gave you a list of options, right? And as I did to the other econ departments I've been arranging to speak at in New Zealand and also in Australia, and bizarrely, everybody but one had picked this paper, which says something about how boring all the rest of my stuff is, I guess. The only outlier was Otago, so they wanted something on biodiversity over 400 years. So, but this paper is, well, the empirical bit of it is actually quite old now. But I guess what's interesting is the sort of evolution of the ideas behind it, and also the fact that the World Bank, that great august institution, has actually taken up one of these ideas, not because of what we did, but and is now sort of turned this into a standard indicator of a country's performance. That's the idea of genuine savings, which we're going to come on to in a little while. And this is joint work, I should say, with Jack Pezzi, some of you might know from ANU, and a couple of other authors on the empirical paper, Karen Turner at Strathclyde and Dougal Tinch, who was my research assistant. Okay, I think how I do it. Yeah. So what I want to do first of all is talk about what is sustainability or sustainable development from the perspective of an economist. And right away, that's going to get us into a little bit of a problem, because how economists think about sustainable development is, on the whole, not how everybody else thinks about it, which is surprising, right? And in fact, almost immediately when one starts defining how most economists think about sustainable development, one alienates everybody else that's interested in the concept, because of a sort of fundamental working assumption that we make use of, or most people working in this area make use of, which is the assumption of weak sustainability, which I'll explain to you. Then I'll briefly go through the features of what we call the working model for Scotland, which is where Jack is a theoretician, and he, over the period 97 through to 2003, 2004, had been developing with people like Geir Asheim and Mike Thoman the theory of how one should measure sustainability. So what I said to him was, wouldn't it be interesting if we could take one of your theoretical models and actually try and apply it to some real data, which is the numbers I'm going to talk about. And so some compromises had to be struck between how he set up his theory model, when he wasn't thinking at all about how you might actually go and measure these numbers, and how we set it up in terms of actually going to try and put some numbers to these concepts. I'll briefly talk about the data sources and problems, measuring this for Scotland. Then the kind of punchline is, well, what do we find for sustainability over the period 92 to 99 in Scotland, looking at these two different indicators, which, just looking ahead, are genuine savings and green net national product, and there's sort of a divergence into and the relationship between these two measures, just to make sure that we weren't getting a sort of uniquely strange answer in terms of the relationship between these two measures, because, as I'll mention, there's a particular paper by Martin Weitzman from Harvard and Geir Asheim from Norwegian Business School, where they set out how these two measures should be related to each other, and we find that they're not. I've got some further evidence from Thailand from one of my PhD students, where again what she's done is calculated green net national product, calculated genuine savings, looked at the relationship between them, and again we find that this theoretical relationship doesn't hold up. And then finally at the end, some conclusions on whether these economic indicators of sustainability are in any sense useful. Because I think the notion 7-8 years ago was that somehow we would come up with an indicator which would attain a level of prominence, a bit like the FTSE 100 or the exchange rate, that you could look up the sustainability indicator today and see, are we doing better than Holland, are we doing better than last year, how does Europe compare with North America? But we don't have that. Or if we do, what we have is not the measure that economists like, What we have instead is a measure that was developed by ecologists called the ecological footprint. So they've clearly been more persuasive in a sort of rhetorical way than we have. People just don't buy our story for some reason, but maybe you'll have a view on that by the time we get to the end. Okay, so, and if people want to interrupt as we go through, please just ask questions. It's probably easier to do that than wait till the end. So firstly, what is sustainability? Well, there's basically two ways that economists have addressed this issue. And I should say that this literature kind of goes back to a series of papers which came out in the early 1970s, where we just had the first oil price shock. Everybody was getting worried about the world running out of resources, and people like Stiglitz and Solow were producing papers on how does an economy which is dependent on a finite non-renewable resource like oil survive? How can we have constant or growing consumption over time if we're stuck with a limited amount of oil? And there was a bunch of papers in a special issue of the Review of Economic Statistics back in 74, I think it was, where a lot of actually the work that is of relevance to sustainable development indicators was originally done. And sort of building on that work, because the concept of sustainable development wasn't around in 1974, and that didn't really come into a sort of popular terminology until the mid-80s, the late 80s. Building on that work, economists have basically come up with two ideas for what sustainability might be. And the first idea is based on the outcome, the end result of the economic process. So it's some kind of notion of what happens to well-being over time. So one definition of sustainability that's been adopted in the literature is that it's a pattern over time where well-being does not fall. So, for example, where utility per capita or consumption per capita is not going down over time. That would be one definition of sustainability. A related but not the same measure, or definition rather, is where we think instead about the resources that we have to generate those outcomes. And this has led to a different kind of indicator, as we'll see. So here the focus is not on the results of the economic process, in a sense, it's on our resources and it's on capital. So it's saying sustainability here is a situation where the potential to generate well-being is being maintained over time. So there, one would define a sustainable development path for an economy as a path where some measure of potential, some measure of capital, we'll say exactly what that includes in a minute, some measure of capital is not going down over time. And that capital is not just the kind of capital that we sort of talk to first years about, but it's actually composed of a whole bunch of different bits. Produced or man-made capital, the kind of capital we're normally used to thinking about, roads and telecommunication network. Natural capital, which would include all non-renewable resources, all renewable resources, nutrient cycling, biodiversity, clean air. Human capital, okay, so economists are used to thinking about human capital. And people have increasingly started talking about another form of capital, social capital. Sort of trust, cooperation, communication networks amongst people. And there's some interesting work on how trust and cooperation measures are related to renewable resource management, for example. So here are the two basic views of sustainability from the point of view of the economics literature. One is where we focus on the outcomes, and the other is where we focus on the potential to generate those outcomes. And as we'll see, these two different definitions lead us to two different indicators or two different measures. Yeah.
I prefer to think of K as a vector rather than some number. So, you have people thinking this is some sort of aggregate thing.
Well, that actually is the heart of the problem. I mean, yeah, I've written it there as a summation in the sense, we've got a bunch of factories and satellite networks, and that's one bit of the capital stock. and then we've got some forests and some fisheries, so we'll add that on. So that's another bit. And then we've got some skills and learning, so we'll add that on. And then there's some other bit which is whatever, trust, cooperation, somehow we measure that and we add that on as well. So yeah, the big K is literally the adding up of all those things. But clearly what that implicitly assumes is you can have more of one and less of the other, and in a sense you're indifferent. And that, conveniently, is the next slide, which is to say, oh sorry, no it's not quite, I wanted to make one other point, which is that almost all of the focus in the economics of sustainability is on intergenerational equity, in other words, fairness over time. But it is true to say that if you look at how non-economists and political interpretations of sustainability play out, they're often also to do with intra-generational equity, but most of the economics literature has not touched on that in terms of sustainability. So when we talk about sustainable development within economics, we're talking about intergenerational fairness. Okay, so let's come back to that capital thing. Both of these economic approaches to defining sustainable development, so whether you're talking about the outcomes approach or whether you're talking about the capital-based, the potential capabilities approach to defining sustainability, have, in terms of the theory, both invoked a working assumption which is known as weak sustainability. I'm not quite sure who originally coined that phrase, weak sustainability. But what it implies for us is that all these different bits of the capital stock are essentially interchangeable with each other. So, sorry? Probably was David Pearce, yeah, probably was. So it's basically saying, it doesn't matter particularly if we run down our forests and if we erode all of our soils and we lose our fisheries, as long as we build up human capital or produced capital to offset that. Now clearly what that implies is, we were talking about this over lunch, that these different elements of the capital stock, if we think about them as different elements, are in a sense perfect substitutes for each other. That no one element is in any sense essential. That we could take any one away as long as we add enough of some other one. In terms of what? Well, in terms of maintaining the functioning of the system, the economic environmental system, and implicitly in terms of generating well-being. So we're saying that nothing is important enough that we have to set a constraint with respect to that bit of the overall capital stock, that anything can be lost so long as we build up some alternative bit of the capital stock. Now, immediately there, economists start finding themselves in disagreement with ecologists, environmental scientists working on sustainability, because they say, well, we have problems with this idea that, for example, you could completely lose all your natural capital, which includes things like, the Earth's climate regulatory ability, the maintenance, the composition of the atmosphere, and as long as we had enough TV sets or a satellite communications network, everything would still work, and in principle we could still be just as happy. Yeah, Jeremy.
I was just wondering, there's one variable that could not sound very different. Instead of the K components all entering in as perfect substitutes, we just put them into the top of it.
Yeah.
Where into this degree of substitution, you can't have nothing in
Well, actually, interestingly, when we come on to talk about sort of rules for sustainability, what if sustainability is something that we ought to have, but the market's not going to generate it, so we want to sort of make it happen. The work that was done on that by John Hartwick, what does he have? Well, in his first paper, he has an aggregate production function, which is Cobb Douglas. So, okay, you can't have no oil, but you can have a very, very small amount of oil. A teaspoon would do, and that's what so although your argument is correct in the limit, as it were, I think a lot of people would still have a problem with with the notion that you can run down any of these natural capital stocks and effectively offset them, as long as you've got a tiny bit left. As long as there's one dolphin somewhere, as long as there's one tree somewhere, Because that's what the implication would be, yeah?
No, I think it depends on your utility function. You can utility function.
Well, he's talking about
the substitution can be very high or very low. You can still have something other than zero or
yeah. But he's talking about so in his model, the only thing that gives people utility is consumption. So what we're worrying about there is how natural capital and produced capital combine to produce consumption goods, which is effectively what I'm talking about here, I guess. Now, if your utility function also contains environmental quality as an argument, then clearly that's a different matter altogether, because there you do, it wouldn't be the case that you could completely run down your environmental quality stock and build up your produced capital if all that gives you is more consumption goods. Yeah?
I think ecologists would have to look at the thresholds, and they're not functioning as a
Yeah, that's right. I think what Jack would say is that most of the theoretical analysis of sustainability in economics assumes you have smooth production functions with no discontinuities. But what the ecologists would say that there are these thresholds that if you cross them, suddenly everything's different, and we don't have that. So.
Well, I think in the context that when you hear the word stuff, they interpret that in terms of utility function, and utility. So
Yeah.
the stuff by itself doesn't have any substantive meaning apart from the utility function.
No. I mean, we're meant, in terms of our definition of sustainability, in terms of outcomes. So, in terms of well-being over time, I guess an argument would be if you breached these constraints, that well-being would decline, perhaps irreversibly. I don't know.
Yeah, not to belabor the point, but I'm sure we're going to spend a whole time on this. But the point that Jeremy talked about, some type of really substitutability between inputs, it seems like the marginal rate of substitution could be so great that it wouldn't lie within a feasible set. It takes a quadrillion dolphins to replace whatever we're talking about here.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are a quadrillion dolphins on the face of the planet. So while yes, there's a rate of substitution there, it's so great that effectively it lies outside our production possibility frontier. So
Right.
It seems like that would be a much more natural, I'm speaking of economists,
Yeah.
it's a much more natural way to talk about thresholds that gets us to pretty much the same place. It seems like we can still use the same framework to analyze this and just speak of rates of substitution that are feasible or not.
Yeah. Okay. Uh-huh. Sorry. I don't know who wanted to say something.
All you need to accommodate the handling of your ecologist friends is indifference curves and production outcomes that look like that. Okay? They were widely taught when I was a student 35 years ago. They were calculated.
Mm-hmm.
The mathematics of that is non-linear. It requires maximum operators. You have to step out of the calculus. But it was well worked out.
Mm-hmm. And I don't think that that's a part of the current analysis of sustainability at all, actually. Well, if it is, I haven't come across it. But yeah.
And there's kind of an important book that John Roberts called Economics of Organizations that relates to social capital. And it's very interesting. Roberts is a micro-theorist. He's not really talking dynamic stuff. But he looks at production processes with kind of multiple optimal things. And so it's not a question of hitting boundaries. It's a question of you might get stuck at some kind of level of equilibrium, and there's something better out there, but you're not going to get it through kind of marginal sort of local changes. But his whole approach to this is trying to think of, well, organizations and institutions create these. They're not really necessarily discontinuities, but they are locally, you're going to be doing certain things. It might be something if you made larger and marginal changes, you're going to jump over to some other regime. And I think that's different than the idea of threshold, which like, if the bacteria go down and the atmosphere goes down, there's a whole new system here. We're playing with that kind of thing versus, well, maybe we'll have some kind of climate change and that'll affect things. But that's within the boundaries of the kind of production things we have. It's just that these production processes have these clusters of inputs that can bring about multiple levels of well-being and
Mm-hmm.
It's mathematical, it's not explicitly dynamic. But I think that idea of just, what's going to happen if everything, one thing goes to zero, or to some boundary, which is going to change the cataclysmic system, that doesn't necessarily right the answer either.
Mm-hmm.
There are alternatives in the Jerry's thing, substitution possibilities, and then what John Roberts' thing is like, well, the production process says, then the substitution possibilities, there's nothing you want to optimum equilibrium,
Right.
I was just trying to think about how you get this idea of what are the aggregate production and consumption lines and how things fit together.
Well, I should get that reference from you. Sounds interesting. Okay. Okay, I'll read that.
But because he takes the idea, we should really be teaching this sort of multiple liquid or multiple optimal stuff more than we do. And I think that might help.
Okay. Talk to Jack about it. He's the theory guy. I'm the numbers guy. He's the theory guy. Did we get through all the comments there? Okay. So I guess one way economists approach these kind of problems is to say, well, should we do we need to worry about this anyway? In a sense, will the market generate sustainable outcomes? Because if it does, well, who cares? It's not really a problem for us to worry about. But the general result in the theory literature is that the market probably does not generate sustainable outcomes. Most of this is focused on the idea of sustainability as non-declining utility over time. Utility is a function of consumption in these models. And typically a trade-off is found between sustaining consumption in the long run and optimal consumption paths over time. Now, what determines the optimal path of consumption over time, of course, is a classical, neoclassical problem. And if you go back to those early papers in 74, people like Dasgupta and Heel and Stiglitz, what were they showing? Well, they showed it depends on things like the rate of technical progress, population growth rates, discount rates. But on the whole, the conclusion that seems to come out of this literature is that sustainable development is not something that the market will generate. So if there's some ethical argument for suggesting that this would be a good thing, then in a sense sustainable development is a merit good that the government sort of has to force on us. The market's not going to generate it. It's a kind of market failure over time. So what are we going to do about it? And Pezzi's got an earlier paper where he shows that in Land Economics in 1997 that actually there might be multiple sustainable consumption paths, and the government's problem then is to choose, in a sense, the best one. Yeah.
Is it a market failure issue, or just that we're using the wrong measure here of
Well, I guess it's a basic difference between thinking about something in terms of how do we optimize over time, and thinking about something in terms of what's a fair allocation of resources over time.
So it's not using the word market failure, you mean market failure in some sense.
I don't mean externalities or imperfect information. No, I don't mean it like that. Yeah, well, which is what this is all about. If you talk to philosophers that work on sustainable development, like Brian Norton at Georgia Tech, he'd say, you shouldn't be surprised about this because these are two different objectives here. The economic models are looking at present value optimality. Sustainable development's an ethical issue. This is just not the same thing. So why should you be surprised that you don't get the same outcome? So what that has led to is people becoming interested in, well, okay, if the market process doesn't generate sustainability, what could we do about that? And that's led to a number of suggestions, which I'm not really going to dwell on too much, but just to mention them. The most important one is this rule. I don't think he called it a rule, but people call it a rule, and which John Hartwick developed in, again, quite a long time ago, a paper in American Economic Review in 1977. Again, coming on the end of this literature on how do we cope with finite resources. Is this a limit to economic growth? I don't know if any of you remember this Limits to Growth book that came out in 1970, saying that the world was doomed. So what John did initially with a Cobb-Douglas aggregate production function, said, well, look, even if you've got this economy which is dependent on this finite non-renewable resource, oil, let's call it, as long as they follow this rule, then they can sustain constant consumption forever. And what was the rule? The rule was you had to reinvest the rent from extracting oil back into the other form of capital, which in his model he only has two kinds of capital. So you reinvest the rent from oil back into telecommunications or whatever, and in his model it gives you constant. Yeah.
Rent is the excessive market price for marginal extraction cost.
In his paper, that's exactly what it is. But it's not actually, to be more precise, it's the difference between the optimal price of the resource in any time period and the optimal marginal cost. So of course, we know that that's not going to be true anyway, because
is optimal price derived from a hoteling model?
Yeah, it is.
Okay. Now, where do you get the optimal marginal cost from?
The good question. I can't remember. I have to go read it. No, I have to come back to you on that one. But it's the optimal price on the natural resource. So he makes the point at the end of his paper. Well, as we all know, very few resource extractors following the hoteling rule anyway. So the idea that you could use current prices, market prices, rather than optimal prices to calculate these rents is not going to give you the right answer. But anyway, he came up with this result. And look, by 2006, this result was still resonating around the World Bank. This is lifted directly from their book, Where is the Wealth of Nations? And they say in there, welfare can be sustained indefinitely if gross saving just equals the sum of depreciation on produced assets, depletion of natural resources, and pollution damages. And that's exactly where that result is coming from. Again, all in a world of weak sustainability, in the sense that in the Hartwick model, we can trade off this declining oil stock by building up the stock of produced capital. Now, of course, if you believe in strong sustainability instead, you're into all kinds of physical constraints, effectively. So what do? You maintain all the natural capital as non-declining, or you just retain bits of it? Kerry Turner talked about critical bits of natural capital. I mean, do you maintain it non-declining in physical terms or in value terms? Herman Daly, who was a big noise at the World Bank a few years ago, he came up with some operational principles for sustainability, talking about how we manage renewable resources, and talked about this El Sarafi principle, which is where you basically reinvest the rents from non-renewable resource extraction into a renewable substitute. But that turns out to be rather difficult to operationalize in practice rather. So summarizing where we got so far, what we said is that if we look at the economics literature, there's basically two ways that have been taken to defining sustainability. One focuses on the outcomes of the economic process, the other focuses on the capabilities of the economic system in terms of capital. Both of these have involved what has become to be known as the weak sustainability assumption. Sustainability is not like to be something that results from present value optimization. It's a fairness criterion which in some sense needs to be enforced, and there are a number of approaches to defining the rules that we could put in place to try and make that come about. But what we're interested in is how you might actually measure it. In other words, if a government decides, well, we think sustainable development is a reasonable objective, how do we actually discover whether we are moving closer to, further away from a sustainable development path? So for the rest of the time I want to talk about measuring sustainability. And again, not thinking about how the great majority of people think about this problem, because of course the great majority of people thinking about this problem are not thinking about it as economists, but just thinking about it as economists have thought about the problem. And one can divide the literature into those people who've thought about it in terms of our first definition, this non-declining well-being over time, and those people who've thought about it in terms of the second way of defining the problem, is maintaining capital. So in terms of the first of these approaches, then what's come out of literature is something called green net national product, and we'll just discuss what that means and how you might measure it. What's come out of the second way of thinking about things is something called genuine savings, or augmented savings, or net savings. And again, I'll go through what that means in the literature and how you might measure it and what it tells us. So the first approach then, focusing on outcomes, green net national product. So it's going to focus on some measure of income, national income, typically. And I suppose historically it dates back to John Hicks's thoughts on how you define income. And then one of his thoughts on how you define income is it's the most we can consume now without reducing our potential for future consumption, our wealth. So income sort of sounds a bit like sustainable income in that context. That's maybe one historical antecedent of this train of thought. And then the most important thing that happened was a guy called Martin Weitzman, who's a Harvard economist in 1976, I think it was, produced a paper, again, nothing to do with sustainable development, looking at the link between net national product and an optimal growth model in the economy. And in that paper, he made a couple of claims, one of which suggests that current period net national product is a maximum feasible level of constant consumption from now to infinity in an optimal growth model. So that sounds a bit like sustainable income. In other words, that if we could measure it properly using real numbers, if we could measure net national product properly, we might have a measure of sustainable income. And the other point that came out of that paper was how you might derive an expression for net national product, or adjusted net national product, or green net national product, which was by basically setting up an optimal growth model with the environment as part of it, either providing inputs to production or assimilating the waste of production or as a source of utility, and just look at the Hamiltonian in that problem and say, can we derive from that an expression for net national product in utility terms? And of course then you have the problem for then converting that from utility terms to terms we can actually measure in monetary terms based on the national accounts. So that's the kind of background to this, and that's all a long time ago. And then about the late 1980s, early 1990s, John Hartwick again started doing some work on if you wanted to adjust the accounts of a country, the national accounts, to represent the depreciation of environmental assets, how would you do that? And he picked up this Weitzman paper and said, here's the methodology. I'm now going to apply this first of all to non-renewable resources, and now to renewable resources, and now to pollution. And he came up with a series of suggestions for what that implied should be a measure of, if you like, green net national product for an economy. So green in the sense of it allows for what's happening to bits of our capital stock which normally get missed out of the national accounts. So if you pick up the national accounts for New Zealand, it's not going to tell you what's been happening to the biodiversity stock over time. It's not going to tell you what's been happening to the fishery stock over time. It will tell you what's been happening to your produced capital stock, but it won't tell you about the forests. And that's the adjustment that John was trying to make in this work. Yeah.
Well, that's the broken window.
Tell us about. I've never heard that phrase. The broken window.
Well, you can increase GDP by going down the main street breaking windows and generating income for blazes. But what you've done is diverted income, potential income, of course, away from some other use. So the resources which are used to clean up have been diverted away. So to deduct those resources, or to deduct that income out of GDP would be incorrect, because you are still generating from the income that would be generated from alternative activities, if you have been breaking windows for energy and so forth.
Never heard of that. There is actually an enormous argument in this literature on how you account for pollution, and whether you deal with pollution abatement expenditure or whether you account for pollution damages. But we'll come on to that in a minute.
And the argument revolves around whether that expenditure makes you better off, or whether in fact it just returns you to the position that you were previously. And that to me is the more important thing. Rhetorically, that's so we should account for
I mean, we're going to end up, sorry, just one last thing, we're going to end up saying that in terms of the utility function, we specify disamenity from pollution is going to be in there, which gives us the kind of rationale for including damage costs from pollution in our green net national product calculation. Sorry, Bob, what were you doing?
Both these numbers here are not discounted. Both the payroll income and they're both assuming some constant level of non-discounted income or non-discounted income.
I don't quite understand what you mean.
When you talk about current period NFP is the maximum people of current consumption, so that's not discounted.
Yeah. But we'll see in a minute how to discount. I mean, actually, when we calculate these things, we are going to discount, bizarrely. But what we discount is not going to be what we normally discount. But maybe I can wait until I get to that point. No, because what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking forward to how the production possibility frontier might shift over time. But we're going to be discounting that back to the current period in calculating our green net national product and genuine savings, which is what we called augmentation in the paper. Okay, let me move on. So, picking up your point, Marcus, the recognition that many environmental services and impacts and assets get left out of conventional national accounting, so pollution impacts, running down of natural resource stocks, and the fact that the Rio Conference on the Environment in 1992, the world's countries agreed to produce sets of sustainable accounts. Put those two things together with that theoretical literature, and what you had then was a big explosion in the kind of mid to late 1990s of a theoretical literature on the correct green adjustment that should be made to the system of national accounts, to national income. And that kind of paralleled a sort of series of ad hoc adjustments which people like the Statistics Office in the Netherlands were suggesting, and people like the World Resources Institute were suggesting in Washington. Okay, so that's one measure, and we'll come back to how it's calculated in a minute. What is it actually going to be a sustainability indicator? Well, there's a bit of a disagreement in the literature, as you might kind of anticipate. There's no agreement across all the economists who have been working on this issue about whether green net national product actually is a sustainability indicator. Thomas Aronson, in his book in 1997, says absolutely not. Geir Asheim in 1994 said only if you use the correct prices to value environmental depreciation. He said those would be the prices that would rule on a sustainable development path anyway, in which case you wouldn't need to worry about the problem. Pezzi and Toman in 2003 said you can only derive a one-directional test for an economy. In other words, you could show whether it was unsustainable, but you couldn't prove it was sustainable. And their test was, is green net national product rising or falling? And they showed that if green net national product was falling over time, that meant the economy was unsustainable in the sense that the level of utility from current period consumption was not a level of utility that could be sustained over time given the economy's resources. And finally, Asham and Weitzman in Economics Letters in 2003, I think it was, said that welfare is increasing over time if and only if real net national product is increasing, and that changes in green net national product mirror dynamic welfare changes. So they've sort of fairly strongly said that it was a measure of sustainability, although that's within a theoretical model where, in a sense, they can impose the appropriate prices on the underlying capital changes. So that's one approach, and we'll calculate that for Scotland and also for Thailand. The other approach is based on capabilities, on capital, and it's called genuine savings, which was a term which was invented by David Pearce in a paper in 1993 in Ecological Economics with Giles Atkinson, and was taken up by a guy who was his PhD student then, Kirk Hamilton, who's now the chief environmental economist within the Environment Division at the World Bank, and who's been responsible for pushing this idea at the World Bank level. And the insight that these guys had was that if wealth is the basis of future welfare, then the current changes in wealth must have consequences for future welfare. So what we need to do is sort of measure how is our wealth changing right now, wealth being our total capital stock, whether produced or natural or human or social. And here's a quote from the World Bank, 2006. Persistently negative genuine savings implies a country is on an unsustainable path and welfare must fall in the future. So that's a pretty strong statement there. So according to the World Bank, anyway, this is a very strong indicator of unsustainability or sustainability in a country's development path. And basically, how do you evaluate it? Well, you basically say, in any time period, what are the changes in all the different bits of the capital stock? You know, we look at forests, are they going up, they're going down? We look at fisheries, are they going up, going down? We look at factories, we look at human capital. We end up with some physical measure of the change in those capital stocks over an accounting period, a year. And then with appropriate prices, and there's a big argument in the literature about what exactly are the correct prices that you should use here, you calculate a measure for the overall net saving, if you like, of the economy, or the overall net investment of the economy. So really the only innovation here is to think about, you know, that some of these bits of capital are natural capital. So genuine savings, in a sense, is a subset of Green Net National Product. Green Net National Product is going to include genuine savings as part of the calculations, you'll see if you read our paper. Is genuine saving a measure of sustainability? Well, a paper Hamilton and Clemens, 1999, if genuine savings is negative, then future utility will be lower. So that's unsustainable development. Pezzi and Toman, a one-sided test only. Hamilton and Vitagan, I think this is in the Canadian Journal of Economics, if genuine saving is positive and increasing, then consumption will rise over time. So that's a pretty strong claim. And now the World Bank uses this every year to report on country-level sustainability. And Ross, let me skip that one. These are some numbers from Bolivia, which is unsustainable, just to give you the kind of calculations that the World Bank does. And the World Bank actually puts everything in as a percentage of gross national income. So they start out with gross savings for Bolivia, 2003, 12% of national income. Okay, depreciation of produced capital was 9%. So now we're down to 3% net investment. But we spent money on education, that's investing in human capital, that puts it up to 8%. But then we add in the depreciation of all these natural capital stocks valued in terms of their resource rents using current period prices, not optimal prices at all. So in Bolivia, that's oil, gas, copper, silver, gold. Now we're down to minus 1%. Pollution damages 2.8%. So you end up with a negative genuine savings of about 4% of national income. So according to that calculation, Bolivia was unsustainable in 2003. In other words, the prediction from those theory papers is their future utility will be lower. Future consumption will be lower. I'm staying with Ross Cullen at Lincoln. He dug up these numbers for me for New Zealand in the year 2000. So this is from a World Bank report as well. So this is what the picture would have... So New Zealand in 2000 was a definite plus on the old Sustainable Development checklist. 11.8% of gross national income for genuine savings. But you can see, I think the only reason these numbers are interesting is you can see, what are the kind of big hitters here. So here's gross national savings, 17.7% of gross national income. Then you used up about 11% of your fixed capital, that's produced capital. But you spent 7% on education, so that goes into a plus. This is depletion of energy resources. I don't know what those would be, coal, I guess, or mineral depletion. Net forest loss was 0. PM10 damages were 0. I can't believe that would be true from what I hear about Christchurch in the winter. But and then CO2 emissions, 0.4% of gross national income. Now I think these calculations are wrong actually, because they've used a very outdated estimate of costs of CO2 in damages, and it's not obvious that they should have looked at global damages. They probably should have looked at damages within New Zealand, but that's an issue which we can come back to. And if you look at a time series, so this time series starts in 1970 and finishes in 2004. And here's 0 for New Zealand. Seem to have you went to unsustainable development for some bizarre reason in 1991-92. And all I could see, obviously I don't know anything about the New Zealand economy at all, was that for some reason in 1991-1992, gross fixed capital formation in New Zealand just crashed. I have no idea why that would be, but it did. Ah, okay. Okay. But you can see that if you'd applied that methodology to New Zealand anyway over that time period, the overall message that would come out was sustainable development.
What's happening with population?
Yeah. Most people don't handle population change at all in these calculations. I mean, for one reason that if you look at most of the theory papers, they are representative agent models. So there's only one person anyway. But more seriously, I guess there's no reason why you couldn't express this on a per capita basis. How much capital is there per person in the country, and look at it like that. But typically, they're not adjusted for population. I'm sure, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, in fact, these World Bank calculations, these are World Bank calculations, not New Zealand government calculations. They just look at education spending. That's the measure of investment in human capital. Okay, so let me briefly move on to what some issues in genuine savings and green national product. So there's a big argument in the literature about how you calculate this depreciation of natural capital, how you calculate these rents. Jeff Vincent has got a paper in '97 where he showed that the way people typically calculate these rents is wrong, and he suggested some alternatives because he said, well, what this implies is that countries are following optimal depletion plans for their natural resources, and we probably think that's not true. The treatment of new discoveries, if you find some new oil, should that count as an appreciation of your natural capital stock? Most people say yes. Your point about human capital, how do you measure investments in human capital? Most papers in the literature just look at spending, and I think I'd be right in saying in the national accounts, a lot of spending on education is counted as government consumption rather than investment. So it's kind of hidden. It's sort of, is that right? So it's kind of, you have to kind of. Okay. So actually, the results we've got for Scotland, we then reclassified that as investment rather than consumption to see if it made a difference. It did make a bit of a difference. An argument about pollution, how do you deal with stocks versus flows? What do you do about transboundary pollutants? If New Zealand is generating CO2 emissions, should the damages from those emissions show up in the New Zealand national accounts, or should they show up in the national accounts of Bangladesh? Mahler's got a paper on that where he discusses the pros and cons of those two approaches. Treatment of technical change, it's treated in the literature. The more recent papers on genuine savings and green net national product have got measures of technical change in them. In other words, there's shifts out in the technical production function of the economy over time. But how you then bring that into actual measures of genuine savings or green net national product, the World Bank doesn't. We tried to for Scotland, but it turned out to be kind of difficult. And then just missing data. If we're trying to incorporate all the changes in all our natural capital stocks, that is a massive information collection exercise. That data just doesn't exist. If I said, what I want to know last year, what was the net appreciation on natural capital in New Zealand, nobody would have that information. Okay. Now, an obvious question is, okay, so there are supposedly these two measures, green net national product and genuine savings, that economists have come up with. Is there any link between them? Well, there's this paper by Aschheim and Weizmann, Economics Letters, in 2001, where they say, actually, yes, in a theoretical model of an economy, which is a present value maximizing economy, what they show is that the time derivative, the rate of change of green net national product, should be equal to the real interest rate multiplied by the level of genuine savings. Proposition 4 in their paper. So they derive that theoretical relationship between the two measures. And they go on to state that if green net national product is rising, then genuine savings must be positive, and vice versa. So one obvious thing one can do is to see, well, does this hold if you look at real data? Okay, so just briefly then, moving on to look at the stuff that we did. So this was a paper which came out in Ecological Economics in 2006, and it was a kind of a reworking of an earlier paper in 1999, where what we did was we calculated a whole bunch of different sustainability indicators for Scotland, not just economic measures. We also calculated things like ecological footprints, genuine progress indicator, and the index of sustainable economic welfare. But it was a very kind of simplistic treatment of the green net national product and genuine savings. So what we wanted to do with Jack was revisit this, looking at sort of recent theoretical advances in the concept and seeing if we could put some numbers on that. And the main sort of tiny contributions that this paper made was to, for the first time in an empirical paper, try and recognize something called the value of time. Now, in the body of papers which Weizmann and Pezzi and Thoman and Aschheim have produced, they have this thing called the value of time, where the production possibilities of an economy depend on its capital stock, but also on time passing. So this is sort of like exogenous technological progress, if you like. Time might also expand our consumption possibilities. For example, if we're an oil exporter and the real price of oil is rising over the next 15 years, then clearly our exports are worth more. So in some sense we're better off. So what they do in those theory papers is they have something called the value of time, which turns out to enter both the optimal value for green net national product and the optimal value for genuine savings. So one thing we wanted to do is to see whether you could calculate that empirically. So then we also have this one-sided sustainability test about whether green net national product is falling or genuine savings is negative, meaning the economy is on an unsustainable path. And then we compare this Aschheim-Weizmann condition on the link between these two measures for the first time. I think the paper was made available, so I'm not going to go through the model in any great detail, and just to highlight some aspects of it. We've got 5 natural resource stocks, which we're going to keep track of. A mixture of renewable and non-renewable resources, which evolved just according to basically production. The stock change is equal to discoveries plus any natural growth minus production, and production can be divided into production for home consumption and production for exports. We've got a stock of man-made or produced capital, which evolves in the normal way. We've got a stock of foreign capital, which changes over time because we're earning money on it and because we're exporting and then we're paying out for our imports. We've got an aggregate production function which depends on the capital stock, on the amount of resources we use domestically, like how much of our oil we consume domestically, and also on exogenous technical progress, which depends on time. So then production plus net imports given world prices distributed amongst consumption, gross investment, pollution abatement spending. Why is that in there? It's because we're going to have a utility function which depends on both consumption and the level of pollution and the level of a public good. We also spend resources on looking for new resources and on digging them up. So utility, as I've just said, is going to depend on consumption, pollution, and the stock of a public good. And that public good stock depends on government spending. So the government spends money to produce the public good. which in our case is agri-environment schemes. So the government pays farmers to generate nice wildlife habitats and beautiful landscapes. And then we have 6 kind of pollutants that we keep track of. So within the model, we've got pollution being produced as a result of production and as a result of investment in abatement equipment, in pollution control equipment, which is costly. Sorry, something went strange with a transposition from the PDF file to PowerPoint. So a question mark is a minus. So we end up with, if you read the paper, you can see the background to these expressions. But basically, just to point out a couple of things. So the first thing here is our expression for augmented green net national product. So this is with the value of time included. Time is this value QT. And that's really just the value of this exogenous technical progress in terms of enhancing production possibilities and, if you like, resource price appreciation over time. So here's where discounting comes in, because in principle we're going to be discounting these future gains using, in our case, in most of the literature as well, a constant utility discount rate. So augmented green national product is going to depend on consumption, the level of pollution. This is the utility, or rather willingness to pay for the public good times the level of the public good. And then these are changes in our capital stocks, produced capital, foreign capital. So this is the hoteling rent, changes in the stock of natural resources and the value of time. And you can see that here is genuine savings. So genuine savings is, in a sense, a component of augmented green net national product. Yeah.
So that's like the present discounted value of time.
Their argument is this: that if you're interested in an instantaneous measure of our sustainable consumption possibility, that should take some account of how are our production possibilities changing over time. And they say there are 2 things we can think about here. One is, as time goes by, resource productivity improves. So a partial differential of the aggregate production function with respect to time, effectively, is exogenous technical progress. So that shifts out over time. In principle, we could be better off, even with the same resources.
So even if the production possibility frontier, shifts out in the future, in a sense, we build that into our current
measure of sustainability. Remember, what we're trying to do here is measure sustainability.
Well, that, I'm not going to do time here, but that gets back to the fundamental philosophical issue. If it turns out that future generations will be wealthier, then maybe the income stream should be going back to us, as opposed to forward. But this obvious.
Well, no, that's a separate point, I think, here. I mean, I think what
it just completely ignores that possibility and doesn't tie into the issue that we're
No, and in fact, in all this literature, there is, in my view, a big confusion between what is originally motivating this work, which is a concern for equity over time, and how do we model it, which is present value optimization in a classical growth model. So there's a slight incongruity, is that how you say it, between these 2 things, that what we're trying to represent is rather different to how we're trying to represent it. But I think that's because of this history, that you had all this body of work out there in the mid-70s, all this stuff about how do you handle limited resources in an optimal growth model. And I suppose people didn't want to throw it away, in a sense. They wanted to kind of build on this. So maybe that explains it, but I don't know, Jack could probably give you a better, given that he's the theory guy, a better explanation of why we ended up like this. But that's effectively what it's trying to say. It's trying to capture how are our possibilities expanding over time, even though we're not doing anything. These are exogenous to us. The world oil price has nothing to do with what Scotland's doing. The passage of time making us smarter. We're not so endogenous technological progress not in here, which is a problem when we come to do it empirically, because for the UK anyway, it's very hard to separate out what's the resource productivity effect of endogenous versus exogenous technical progress. I mean, I don't know any papers that do that. Well, no, if you thought for some reason that technological progress was going to go backwards, or that that's a silly thing to say, or for example, you're an oil exporter and your prediction is that world oil price is going to fall over time. Well, that could easily be a negative term there, because now you're going to be looking forward actually being worse off in terms of your resources. Yeah. Green net national product, yeah. Basically, I mean, the full details are in the paper, but basically we have a utility function for our representative individual, which has got these three things in it. Well, it's got C, E, and B in it. That's what. Sorry, B is the public good. It's the quantity of the public good. It's hectares of national parks, if you like. That's actually what it is. It's not very satisfactory. Okay, so actually we have it here. So greening the national accounts is deducting the disimmunity cost of emissions, adding the net benefit of these public goods, deducting the value of resource stock depletions valued using, hey, we'd like to be hoteling rents, but we don't even have any estimates of marginal costs for some of these resources. We've only got average costs. And then this value of time thing, and I'll show you where that comes from in a minute. Very briefly on the data, so we do this from 92 to 99. Okay, we should have thought of this before we started, but Scotland's not actually a country, so it doesn't actually have any national accounts. So we had to actually construct these ourselves from regional accounts, Scottish input output tables, and a whole bunch of different sources. Because I wrote a research grant which said we were going to do this for Scotland. Well, I was going to do this and do a CGE model. We did the CGE model for Scotland, but then when we came to do this, we thought, oh, hold on a minute. But actually, as a result of... and the other thing is, officially, oil and gas are not part of Scotland in the national accounts, because they're part of the UK continental shelf or something. But, to make it interesting, we pretended they were Scottish. Which politically somewhat confrontational. Okay, and actually, bizarrely enough, I was very surprised at this. There were at that point, over that whole time period, no measures of actual emissions of these pollutants for Scotland on a consistent basis. So what we do is we estimated emissions over time based on the relationship between units of output at the 27 classification level of the National Input Output Table and emission output intensity figures taken from UK-based data. So we're basically assuming that a Scottish firm in industry X is as polluting as an English firm in industry X producing the same thing, which is not terribly satisfactory. We need to estimate damage costs, as we show in the paper. We don't have these for Scottish sources at all, so what we've done is taken a range of figures from UK and EU sources, and they're all in the paper if you're interested. We need to value our natural capital changes. Okay, you can estimate the value of stocks, how they change over time relatively easily for forests and fisheries and coal, oil. But then you need this hoteling rent thing, and nobody's going to pretend that the UK government has managed its natural capital on any kind of optimal basis, so certainly our prices are wrong. And in fact, we couldn't find marginal cost figures for a lot of these resources, so we ended up using average cost figures. So we've got market price minus average cost, not optimal price minus marginal cost. And then finally, we've got this value of the public good, which is think of it as hectares of national park, valued using willingness to pay figures taken from the literature. Well, from one of our studies, in fact. So there are a whole bunch of these environmental adjustments of varying degrees of ad hocery. This value of time thing, so basically we've taken an estimate for the UK from Crafts and Mahoney of estimates in total factor productivity growth, projected that for the 2020, and what that means is we've mixed up endogenous and exogenous technological progress, but, well, can't do anything about that. Resource price appreciation, we just did it for oil, over 20 years, using actual data up to 2001, and then oil price predictions from 2001 onwards. Then all those values of time are discounted back to the current period, and we discount that using a 2% discount rate, and then we test for whether that makes any difference to our results. Okay, and then what did we find? So the not very interesting punchline is this. Now at this point I could, if anybody's interested, these are the actual numbers. Thanks very much. And they're actually in a sense easier to see on a table than they are on a picture, but let me show you on a picture. So this is a time series from 1992 to 1999. Genuine savings being measured on the right-hand axis, green net national product on the left-hand axis. And as you can see, that first of all, green net national product is going up, so we sort of pass that sustainability test. Genuine savings is positive in all time periods, so we pass that sustainability test as well. But actually, what you'll see if you're interested and you look at the numbers on the piece of paper you've just been given, the green adjustments for a country like Scotland make very little difference. In other words, if you plotted net investment and conventional net national product on the same graph, it would look pretty much like that. And I bet you that would be exactly the same story for New Zealand. On the other hand, an interesting result did emerge when we looked at this Aschheim-Weizmann result on the link between green net national product and genuine savings. Now these two things should be equal in the sense that the rate of change of green net national product should be equal to the real interest rate multiplied by genuine savings. But as you can see, these things aren't even close. You know, the scales on these axes are very different, which shows you how far apart they are. And in the numbers you have in front of you, you can see how far apart they are. So in this real economy with these very imperfect numbers, this theoretical result did not hold up, but maybe one shouldn't be even slightly surprised about that.
So it's not just the trend that we want to mention, it's the actual numbers.
Yeah, well, in their paper, they claim that these numbers should be the same. Exactly. We have some thoughts in the paper about why that might be. And I was asking Jack the other day on email if he had any further thoughts on why that might be, and he said that would take a very long conversation. So, but we can reflect on that a little bit perhaps later on.
It looks like changes in the industry are going to drive that further on. Because the previous graph, there wasn't much slope.
Yeah. Genuine savings is the darker line there. So,
So you're multiplying that?
yeah. That, according to this paper in Economics Letters, these are the two. These two shouldn't be equal, but these two should be equal. Yeah, and clearly they're not. But given the imprecision of our calculations, perhaps by itself is enough to explain this. Although we have some other arguments in the paper, like their model assumes that all resources are fully employed. Clearly, there's a business cycle going on through this period. But
So is your interest rate 2%?
we tried it with different. No, it's 2%. Yeah. I mean, one could use the real interest rate. I mean, when they say the real interest rate, they don't mean a real interest rate like that. They mean in terms of the way they set up their model, the real interest rate, which is not the same thing at all. It would actually be sort of like the shadow price of capital in their optimal growth model. We played around with this thing about how you classify education. So in Scotland's quasi-national accounts, education is government spending. If you reclassify it as investment, it does make a difference. So let's see here. 6% and 6%, the green and these two lines here both have the same discount rate, but in the blue case, we're reclassifying spending on education as investment in human capital, and that pushes up our estimate of genuine savings. It makes it, in other words, it makes Scotland look more sustainable. Well, obviously, you're adding a plus to the calculation and replacing that zero with that plus. So obviously, it's going to increase it. Now, based on these data, Scotland did not fail the weak sustainability test over the period in question, so that's very nice. As I've always pointed out, if you look at the numbers in front of you, in our case, the environmental adjustments made little impact. So once we've gone through all this process of calculating the rents on resource depletion, the costs of pollution emissions, the value of public goods, we don't end up with much more than, at most a 7% difference on the conventional national accounts. And of course, that's because Scotland is not a resource-dependent economy in any slight sense of the word. Yeah? That's in real terms, yeah. Yeah. Closing down of the entire Scottish steel industry accounts for most of it, which happened in 94 when they shut Ravenscraig. There's your major pollution source gone overnight, basically. Plus, if you look at national trends on sulfur dioxide and particulates, they're declining sharply, driven by things like, for example, technological standards on cars would be one. The European directive on sulfur emissions from power stations would be another one. Or, regulatory impact in terms of SO2 emissions from power stations.
Have they been phasing out burning of coal for power?
Well, yes, there has been a gradual switch away from coal, but even where we're still burning coal over this time period, there's been a retrofitting of pollution abatement equipment. So what we're measuring is sulfur emissions, and they're declining over time.
Apparently, in Scottish cities, there is no standard living government station that samples the air every 24 hours.
There is in Edinburgh. There's one.
There's one in the whole nation. There's none in Glasgow, particularly, which is a large industrial metropolis. And if such data is collected, it's not consistent. There's not form of consistent time series or anything.
Which is why we had to estimate emissions by using these coefficients of output to emissions from UK data, which have been changing over the time period it concerned, which is why we can incorporate this decline in SO2 emissions. I didn't know the one in Edinburgh was the only one. I knew there was only one in Edinburgh, but I didn't know that was the only one. Because we were going to do a hedonic price study in Edinburgh, and I said to the council, how many air quality monitoring stations have you got? And they said, one. Okay, forget that idea then. We can't do that. So green national product and genuine savings may be a better measure of well-being than conventional accounts because they do allow for these pollution damages. And certainly in our case, what it showed that was a big gap in environmental accounting at the Scottish level. We just weren't collecting any kind of consistent, regular time series on stock changes for our natural resources. They had to be compiled from all kinds of different sources, most of them not government. A recent thing was to say, well, that's what we found for Scotland. Maybe Scotland's just weird. Why don't we try and do this for another country? Another country where maybe resources are more important. And so we've just finished doing it for Thailand. And Thailand is an exporter of quite a few aggregates. It's got a big forest sector. So we thought, well, maybe here we'll find a bigger difference between green GNP and conventional NNP, between genuine savings and conventional net investment. But even for Thailand, in fact, we don't find any big differences. These are the results for genuine savings. So, zero's down here somewhere. So in all these years, from 1990 through to 2004, Thailand had sustainable development according to the genuine savings indicator because it's positive in every year. We just mess around with how you calculate these resource depletion terms. The dark bars is the way the World Bank does it. The light bars is the way that Vincent said was more correct. Doesn't make much difference, as you can see from there. Here's the numbers for net national product. So you can see even for Thailand, you can it's hard to see the difference between these two lines. So the line with circles is green net national product. The other line is conventional net national product for Thailand. And again, you can see that there isn't really, just as the case for Scotland, much difference between these two, which kind of begs the question of not quite sure if this is worth it. Jerry?
I'm using this as sort of a replication example. So spend more time on the detail about this Scottish example. We've already said that we have computation about certain volume or something that's certain bits for your Scottish estimation.
Yeah.
How much worse these turn to get you should go to less developed countries.
Much worse is the answer.
So are you confident in the data of your money?
No, I don't think so. I mean, we've done the best we can given the data that's available for Thailand. And most of the numbers actually don't come from government sources. They come from industry sources for cumulative production each year, for example, for natural resources. And we don't, as I recall, have pollution for anything other than CO2. So. No, I mean the only interesting result really to come out from it is this picture, which is the this Ashheim-Weizmann comparison for Thailand. And again, you can see, these numbers are supposed to be the same as each other, but again, check out the values on the axes here. Again, we're talking orders of magnitude difference. But no, I have no idea whether the size of the error we're making for Thailand is pushing our green net national product higher or lower than it should be. It's not obvious to me how we would figure that out, in fact. So even if we take another country, we don't get this theoretical relationship, and we do kind of dwell on why that might be.
If we leave that slide,
Yeah.
if you took this theoretical result and you wanted to say that, well, on balance, we're actually negative, you repeat that by taking the industry test that you can say, well, actually, below zero, we're coming down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that, in that particular indicator, you took the industry times that if you change of the then that's indicating that actually comes down to zero.
Mm-hmm.
What the other figure suggests it is.
Well, I mean, the only sustainable test we've got is this thing. Is it going up or going down? So here, I don't know what was going on here, but in this period here and this period here, there was a crash in the conventional net national product. Green net national product was also declining. So according to that test, this is a period of unsustainable development, which hopefully, I didn't check that, but so that's for...
No, I was just thinking in terms of your test is a nice little intuitive geometric thing like it's falling or it's rising. You're sort of getting that kind of thing. But
Yeah.
if you get to the next graph, then you've got a period under the black dotted line where it's always under zero.
Mm-hmm. That's right, yeah. Yeah. So here's here's that first period of economic crash in Thailand, and here's the second, less crashy crash in Thailand. But yeah, I mean the point is, right? Sorry, it's probably not a very clear figure. So let me just, sorry, yeah. Ah, right. Yeah, that's a very, very good question. I guess people have really only calculated these kind of measures for countries on the whole. And they say, well, the only thing that matters is thinking about national well-being. So we don't care about what's happening to anybody else. We just care about national well-being. Now, of course, in the literature on the ecological footprints, there's this dominant thought that not every country can have a positive footprint, which might be the same as saying, well, we do need to worry about what's happening in other countries, or although that ecological footprint is something that people do calculate on even a regional or a county or a city basis. I mean, we have people calculating it for cities in Scotland, for villages. Eh? Is that right? Oh, okay. Ah, okay. Anyway, let me just finish with some conclusions. What do these kind of calculations really tell us? Well, having just messed around with this, really. I mean, these are the only two bits of work that we've done, the two bits for Scotland and the bit for Thailand. And so if someone said, well, so what? I think my main so what would be, I think it does produce a slightly better measure of well-being than the conventional national accounts, because you are at least allowing for changes in things which we know have some impacts on well-being which aren't included in the conventional accounts. Although the point you made earlier that arguments about how to do this undermine the credibility of the numbers that we generate. I think the genuine savings measure does say something about whether a country is reinvesting enough of its resources to maintain future well-being. I mean, that's certainly the way the World Bank thinks about it. And it certainly shows up gaps in our environmental accounting at a national level. When you start trying to put these numbers together, you realise that we don't measure the changes of our natural capital stocks in anything like a consistent manner. But as to whether it produces an indicator of sustainability, I'm not too sure. And I think the reason I'm not too sure, I can illustrate by just looking at this picture for Thailand again. Maybe this one's clearer. So, no, it's not. Go back to the green national product one. So what that says is this economy, which presumably isn't doing anything radically different over this time period here, if we'd taken a snapshot of this economy around about here, we would have concluded that it was very unsustainable. If we'd taken a snapshot of that economy in 2002, on the other hand, because the green national product is going up, we would have concluded that it was sustainable. And what I haven't seen is anybody doing any work which produces a causal explanation of why these kinds of sign changes happen in these indicators. And certainly one criticism that people have made to me is that these measures seem to be highly sensitive to changes in world prices, and if sustainability is about how you manage your own resources, should you really have a measure which is so sensitive to, for example, the changes in the price of oil, to which I have no answer. Yeah, yeah. No, what the theory says is, for genuine saving, the test is it positive or is it negative? For green net national product, the test is it going up or is it going down? So if it's going down, according to the theory, future welfare will be lower, so it's unsustainable. If it's going up, according to the theory, future welfare will be higher, so it's sustainable. So, well, in theoretical models, forever, because these are discounted over infinite time periods. In our calculations for the next 20 years, which isn't very long. But, if anybody wants to predict the world oil price more than 20 years into the future, I think that would be a brave undertaking. Yeah, we did. Yes, we did. Yeah. Bad. It wasn't our predictions, it was the Energy Administration in the US, but Okay, I think I've probably said enough there.
Well, that's been a great seminar. So I guess if you have more questions, you can see our speaker afterwards, and we know the Prince Staff Club. Anybody who wants to join us.
Good.
Thank you.
All right, thanks very much.
I don't know anything about this literature, and it was,
Well, I don't know much about it. Well, I mean, I know the literature, but it would be easier if Jack was here and we could kind of do a double act.
Put this on.